Well, welcome everyone. We'll be hearing about wildflowers of the Eno River Diabase area today with Lesley Starke. I want to share with you our next virtual lunchbox talk. We hope you'll register for that as well. It'll be on August 27th, and we'll be with Tara Mae Smith and Justin Robinson with Extraterrestrial Projects, and they'll be talking on Carolina xeriscapes, cultivating future landscapes. And I believe the link to register for that, Lauren's going to post that in the chat for you. And we love getting feedback on these virtual programs as well as all of our programs. So feel free to reach out to us. And on the next slide, you'll have our contact information. Also, at the end of the webinar, a new browser window will open up for you to complete a survey about your experience today. So I'm Joanna Lalikas. I oversee the education department here at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. And Lauren Green is with me today providing some moderation support as well. She is also providing interim public program support for the garden. She'll also be assisting us with the Q&A throughout the presentation today and at the end. This presentation today has evolved from a growing partnership between the North Carolina Botanical Garden and the Friends of Plant Conservation and the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program. It is paired with an excursion that we have scheduled for the 19th of September to a Durham natural area along the Eno River. Lauren's going to paste the link for that excursion into the chat. It's currently full, but we are accepting registrations for the wait list in case spots open up. So we had our first excursion on August 1st to the Sandhills to see the fire lilies and other Sandhills wildflowers with protective measures in place related to the pandemic. It was very successful. We heard from instructors, our leaders, as well as participants that it was very successful and that there was excellent compliance to the social distancing and other protocols. So safety is key to these and very important to us. So let me introduce you to our speaker now. Lesley Starke is the program manager for the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program. She has a background in conservation ecology and land protection and restoration. Her professional interests include conserving special places and the species that inhabit them. We'll have time for questions at a few natural stopping points, and we'll also have a couple more polls for you. And we'll hopefully have a bit of time immediately after Lesley's talk for final Q&A. And with that, welcome Lesley. If you'll unmute and share your screen, we'll get started. Thanks for being with us, Lesley.
Hi, all of you. It is a little strange that I can't see you. So bear with me if I'm not making my normal eye contact. But thanks so much for having me today. I'm really happy to be able to join you for your lunch hour to talk about plant conservation, and in particular, what it takes to conserve the wildflowers of the Eno River Diabase sill and surrounding area. So we just did this poll to get an idea of where you all are, but as I put these slides together, I wasn't sure who my audience would be exactly. So just to get us all on the same page, here's a basic map of North Carolina with the Eno River Diabase sill area marked with this red X. This area is in the Piedmont physiographic province. It's North Carolina's largest physiographic province, for anyone who isn't familiar with the state geography. And it sits at approximately 400 feet in elevation. Before we get to the plants, which I know you're excited about, I first want to talk a little bit about the geology, and I'll start with Triassic basins. So the Deep River Basin is the largest of the 3 Triassic basins in the North Carolina Piedmont. These basins formed on the supercontinent Pangaea during the late Triassic between 200 and 237 million years ago, as the landmass of present-day North America and Africa began to pull apart. Hundreds of rift valleys were created, little stretch marks, so to speak. And while some of these rifts continue to enlarge, like the Atlantic Ocean, others, such as the Triassic basins of Eastern North America, stopped expanding and began to fill in with sediments. The area I'm talking about today is the northern portion of the Deep River Basin, which is what's circled here on my map, and it's called the Durham Subbasin. So I've zoomed in now where you can see just the northern portion of the Durham subbasin in this like olive green color. Here the bedrock is sedimentary from all those sediments that were being deposited that I just mentioned. These little red squiggles are intrusions. They're igneous rock intrusions, and they are of diabase. So these are areas where magma was able to intrude into the upper layers of the Earth's surface as the Triassic basins were forming. So quickly, vertical intrusions are called dikes, while horizontal intrusions of magma through layers of sediments are referred to as sills. So magma creating these dikes and sills cooled relatively quickly near the surface, forming a medium grain igneous rock called diabase. So being more resistant to erosion than the surrounding sediments, diabase sills are often found underlying flat uplands. Rounded diabase boulders, stones, and even small pea gravel type pieces can be found scattered on the soil surface and are especially concentrated in creeks and streams where they wash down during erosion events. Soils formed from diabase material are considered mafic, having high concentrations of iron, magnesium, and often calcium. Such an abundance of these elemental nutrients results in a soil or in soils that are circumneutral with a pH greater than 6.5. Now that is significantly higher than the 4.5 to 5.5 more typical pH of the surrounding Piedmont. So weathered diabase soils often have a high clay content as well, and they form very dense clay hardpans just below the soil surface. A shallow hardpan like this creates an impermeable layer within the soil, which both restricts root depth and causes extreme hydrological conditions. So during the winter and spring, the combination of flat topography and a clay hardpan causes perched water table, saturated soil surface, and standing water, even in some locations. Walking through these soils after heavy spring rains is a sticky, mucky mess. You can see in the picture here on the right, these boot imprints. You can guarantee, or I can guarantee you, these people went home with an extra 5 pounds of mud trying to cling to their boots. It's a very sticky soil when saturated. Then throughout the summer and fall, that soil will dry, and with the high shrink swell clay content, it'll cause the soil to crack and become brick-like, hard as concrete. So these two extremes and the fluctuations between them being rather quick and severe throughout the growing season in particular, help to stunt the establishment of woody plants and thus promote a high diversity of forbs and grasses. So I want to go ahead and test out our first poll question for my presentation. Lauren will bring that up. I have a quick question for you all. Here it is. So I'll give you a few moments to answer. Well, I'll read it to you, I guess, while we're waiting. What is the most natural ecosystem association, do you think, for diabase soils? Hardwood forest, grassland open woodland, or a pine heath? Okay, very good. So absolutely, most of you picked up on where I was leading you, or you already knew this, but the natural vegetation of soils soils such as weathered diabase, or of parent stock of weathered diabase, is grassland or savanna or even grassy woodland. It's not to say that there's zero trees, but that the grass and herb component is the star of the show. And that is really thanks to the combination of that soil structure that I was just describing and also the nutrients. So the relatively high pH upland soils in these areas that sit atop the diabase, Iredell and Picture series, for instance, are sometimes referred to as prairie soils because they approximate the neutral or even alkaline pH soils of the prairies in the Midwest of the United States. They're not the same, but there are similarities. But how could that be? You might be thinking, You know, we all have heard, or maybe we know, that everything east of the Mississippi River was virgin forest, right? That a squirrel could cross the region without ever touching the ground, effortlessly passing from tree canopy to tree canopy. Well, surely not, but this concept is still deeply embedded in our collective memories and histories somehow. Even still, like I said before, we know from analyzing the soil that we should expect grasslands, savannas, and open woodlands. And in fact, that's really what there was. So this map, it's from 1718 by Delisle. It's, I'm sure, very tough for you to read, but in the original, you can make out that much of Central Carolina is labeled as Grand Savanna, or like the Grand Savanna, not primitive or continuous forest, lest any of you were, still wondering. The general term for Piedmont prairies describes the unique savanna-like communities that are a natural part of the Piedmont landscape and have existed for thousands of years, maybe longer. Due in part to their open structure, relatively sparse canopy and grass and forb-dominated understory, these species-rich areas have been variously described by explorers, European settlers, and modern botanists as prairies, savannas, plains, meadows, grasslands, open woodlands, glades, barrens, and even old fields. Historically, Piedmont prairies were scattered throughout the southeastern US, typically found in areas with shallow, clayey soils, much like I just described. And these communities, though, do require frequent burning or grazing to maintain their open canopy or diverse understory. It's not enough just to have this one, type of soil. So what does it take to be a prairie or a glade or a woodland? For this part of the world anyway, we started to discuss some of the soil considerations, but like I just mentioned, one of the other key ingredients is adequate sunlight, and for that, we must add disturbance. And in most cases, this means reducing tree density and reintroducing fire. Prior to European settlement, the North Carolina Piedmont likely experienced an average fire return interval, or periodic fire, every 3 to 7 years, which is pretty frequent. Without natural processes like fire or wild grazers, many open areas are quickly overtaken by trees and shrubs, despite that soil shrink swell feature that I described before. Often one of our first steps is to thin out weedy trees and shrubs and see what responds. We're often richly rewarded with the effort. Most of these sites that we burn as well, which I'll be talking more about this here in just a moment, just preempting here, they must first be thinned this way before reintroducing fire to mitigate heavy fuel loads that have accumulated and to increase the amount of light reaching the ground. This photo here on the left was taken really both of these were taken just across the street from the Penny's Bend Nature Preserve, which many of you may have been to or be familiar with. It's in northern Durham County of North Carolina. So if you look at the left image here in this photo, you'll see basically what we have just accomplished is cut down several loblolly pine trees that had more or less invaded what had been maintained previously as an open grazed field. All we did was cut those trees and wait a little bit. And you can see in the photo on the right, there are all kinds of flowering plants now. Most notable, this sea of blazing stars. Now that's not going to be possible everywhere. It certainly depends on how the restoration capacity for a site depends on how, let's say, damaged it's become. But in this case, it took a relatively small amount of work to get quite a lot of response from those prairie, not forest species. Got some, you think this is a picture of flowers, but really I'm trying to show you the soils in situ. So in the photo on the left, we have, I'll go ahead and say it, this is our Silphium terebinthinaceum, or Peridot, sprouting after a fire. What I want you to notice though, is the complete removal of duff layer and the clean burn down to mineral soil. You can even see some of the pea gravel of that diabase soil that I was describing before behind the Silphium. Silphium's photobombing my soil here, I suppose. Then on the right, you can see Echinacea laevigata, or smooth cone flower, flowering right after a spring burn. So this is an area we would have burned in, say, April, and then come back out in June to take this photograph. The plants are quick to flush back out, not just the coneflowers, but you can see quite a lot of new, fresh green vegetation behind them too, following this burn. However, what I really want you to focus on are these remaining bare patches of soil. And then also I want to point out, we do have an example of one of these Diabase boulders hanging out in the background as well. So this is a little bit of what these sites look like, at least shortly after a burn. This is a little less open, you might say. So here's our nearby Hebron Road Glade Remnant Preserve. It's also in northern Durham and in the same vicinity as the Penny's Bend Nature Preserve that you probably are familiar with. This site is recognized as having 7 or more rare plant species in a concentrated dozen acres or so, especially in the upland area closest to the road with this power line right of way that you can just make out here behind the sign. This is a fairly common story with remnant prairies and woodlands. Really most of the important wildflower habitat in the Piedmont, I mean, taken all together. What we have left is often associated with this landscape context, basically the area that has still had enough disturbance, as in maintenance, to provide adequate sunlight. And that maintenance is being done, of course, by the utility companies and the Department of Transportation and groups like that that have other purposes for that maintenance rather than wildflower habitat maintenance. So like many such areas, the site was observed and recognized as having interesting or rich flora. Over time, the rare species have been mapped and recorded with the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program. That record keeping has led to special signage being posted along the right-of-way where the plants are hanging on as young forests are growing into the previously sunny open areas. These signs highlight rare plant species are present, and so no herbicide spraying or mowing, at least not during the growing season, should occur. Unfortunately, zero management isn't ideal either. Of course, we want the plants to be able to grow and reproduce, but with no management at all, they're then threatened by woody encroachment, which is what you're starting to see here. You might be able to make out our Peridot, certainly in the foreground, is nice and big and flush. There's a couple of smooth cone flowers flowering, just about to get choked out here with these young trees growing in. You can really see how thick that forest was growing when you see this follow-up photo where the power company has come in and mulched or done like a mulching mowing of just the power line right-of-way area. The tree thickness just behind there was pretty much marching all the way out to the road. I want to emphasize that when timed appropriately, this isn't a bad thing for natural communities which have evolved with fairly regular disturbances to maintain their habitats. The timing, though, is critical so that we're not just mowing down plants before they get to set seed. But if this can be done in their off-season, then it can be a pretty good way to maintain that open structure and provide adequate sunlight. So the image on the left is that same location after the mowing has taken place and the plants have had a chance to resprout. Hopefully you can see that this right-of-way, scooted over a little bit before I took the photo. Here's the power line in the very top left corner. I hope you can now see that this right-of-way area is full of prairie dock leaves emerging among other prairie affiliates. I mean, they are just thick as thieves in there. Not that you could tell it in that before photo I showed you at first. So a lot of good results can be accomplished with mowing. However, when and where possible, we also like to reintroduce fire, which we believe is a key component to the maintenance of many of these sites. So this photo on the right is just a little bit of eye candy to show you what that looks like. This is actually a fall burn that we did with lots of residual plants still standing. I think we've made it past our first frost, but not much beyond that. So I hope you can see in this image that there are patches of bare soil again in between these re-emerging plants after the fire. So we've got our prairie dock again, but there's all kinds of other good things. Here's some curly heads and some other plants that we're hoping to encourage. But it's the bare soil, again, the in-between spaces that I want to focus on. That's really the key difference. With mowing and burning, woody species will be top killed in with either method. However, a lot of residual biomass remains scattered throughout after mowing. All you've done is chopped it up into little bits, but it doesn't go away. It's just there in a different form. Whereas burns reduce that leaf litter and other plant material, and therefore can lead to exposing patches of actual mineral soil. So some of you might see this and worry about erosion, and that's an important consideration. However, grassland communities, whether they're on the spectrum of full, Midwest style tall grass prairie, or even into a open woodland, in this general grouping of grassland type communities, they're remarkably good at stabilizing soil. They tend to have really robust root structures. And so with that in mind, with decent grassland community, you have a reduced concern over the soil erosion. So some people see bare soil and it makes them a little bit nervous. In these situations, it's definitely a good thing. So again, with the exposed soil, just as these plants have soil nutrient requirements, I was talking about before, those the Mafic quality and the high pH, and also sunlight requirements for them to have a suitable habitat that they can really thrive in. Many of these prairie affiliated plants also benefit considerably from having exposed soil substrate for germinating their seeds. So without this elbow room to grow, the opportunity for these plant populations to reproduce is limited. And I highlight that as one of the juxtapositions between mowing for maintenance and burning for maintenance. Here you can see many of those Peridot plants are blooming. You can't see the leaves so great, but you can see the yellow flowers among many other species. It is definitely rich. Can you believe the transformation? I'm just going to go back and forth here. This is the same area. Certainly, I did take this photo at 2 different angles, or these photos are at different angles, but it's the same site. All of this was just hanging on under this. So a little bit more about fire. So it's one thing to burn places because it is an effective tool, and that it is. You can essentially have one good day of active management, granted with a good bit of prep work and a good bit of follow-up work, but in terms of how much time it takes to implement this management strategy, a lot of the action happens on one day, and you might not need to do it again for another year or two. But even still, as effective as it may be, what can we say about its place on the landscape? Are we just trying to conduct prescribed burns because they're fun and effective? Well, no, but we are trying to reintroduce fire because we believe it should be there. It is a natural process that we think help form these natural communities. But how do we know what we should be emulating exactly? So I mentioned a moment ago that prior to European settlement, the North Carolina Piedmont likely experienced an average fire return interval of 3 to 7 years. The arrival of American Indians in the Piedmont approximately 12,000 years ago, as I understand it, played a major role in maintaining these open areas. For thousands of years, the original inhabitants regularly burned forests to facilitate travel and hunting, and for plenty of other reasons as well. Beginning about 4,500 years ago, American Indian tribes began to establish more permanent settlements based around agriculture. As these cultures transitioned from a primarily hunting and gathering, focused existence, fire emerged again as a useful tool for clearing land for agriculture, not a single purpose tool. Frequent burning of the land perpetuated the existence of these natural communities, mimicking the more sporadic natural lightning-caused fires of the past. Frequent burning leads to an open understory with herbaceous ground cover and scattered mature trees. It doesn't mean that it's eliminating trees, and it doesn't benefit every species equally with the same broad strokes, but it definitely encourages the maintenance of these systems. However, since the 20th century, fire suppression and development in general have restricted Piedmont prairies primarily to roadsides and utility corridors, like I mentioned a moment ago, where they're especially vulnerable to incompatible management, whether it be herbicide use or ill-timed mowing. So this region is home to critically important populations for several severely range restricted and or endemic species. Conserving these species is a really high priority. The more general concept of open woodland is fairly rare, but these particular plants are real gems in our northern Piedmont, and I'm just going to give you a little bit of info about them. So from left to right, we've got Femaranthus piedmontanus. This is the Piedmont fame flower. If you're familiar with the NatureServe ranking system, this would be considered a G1, S1 species, meaning it is critically imperiled. It is exceptionally rare with very few populations globally, but also within the state. It's proposed for state listing in North Carolina, and it's only known in 2 counties, one each in Virginia and North Carolina. So this is not state listed yet. You may have picked up, I said it's proposed for state listing. It was only recently named, and you might not know this, but you have to have a formal scientific name for these legal processes for listing will allow you in. So since the last update to our protected plant list, this species has been officially named, and we've been gathering information on it, and now we're much closer to being ready to propose this for state listing. Marshallia legrandii is our next species here to the right, Oak Barrens Barbara buttons. This is another G1, S1 species, critically imperiled. It's also proposed for state listing in North Carolina. It has the same story. It didn't have an official name the last time we updated our list, but that was essentially the last thing holding it back. Now that we've got that name on the books, it is on the short list proposed for listing. It's also known from only a handful of counties in Virginia and North Carolina. Next here, Echinacea laevigata, or smooth cone flower. This is a G2 S1, so slightly more common in that it is known in a little bit larger distribution. More states have populations of this species, but it is exceptionally rare in North Carolina, keeping it at the S1 status. It is federally endangered and state endangered as well. It's known from Virginia down through Georgia, throughout the Piedmont, but it's not common in any of those states, and many of the populations have been lost over the last few decades, which is part of why it's been recognized on the federally endangered list. And a lot of work has gone into trying to turn that around into a more positive direction. The last species I have here is Baptisia aberrans. This was recently elevated to full species status. It's formerly considered a variety of Baptisia australis from the Midwest Prairies. This is a G2 S2 species, and it is state endangered. This is one that also has a little bit wider distribution. Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina all have populations. This one, but all of those states where they have populations of this plant, it's restricted to woodlands and glades over limestone or mafic substrates with high pH soils. So it's not common anywhere. For each of these, and practically all the rare species in the northern Piedmont, we recognize the same overarching threats: habitat loss, i.e. development or land conversion, and habitat degradation related to fire suppression and the associated woody encroachment. Understanding the threats is critical to making the most effective decisions for protecting these species from extinction. To offset habitat loss, many organizations and agencies, including ours, are using land preservation as the primary tool, buying the land these plants grow on to protect them from land conversion practices. This is essentially a once and done process, although I don't mean to say that it's easy. In contrast, to offset habitat degradation, land management is required. And this is a perpetual process, like I've described earlier. Maintaining open conditions requires regular disturbance, such as tree thinning and prescribed burning. These tasks are labor and resource intensive, but they make a huge difference. Well worth it.
Lesley, before you move on, we've got some questions. If you could repeat the names of the flowers for us and type them in the chat. People are very interested in learning more about them.
Okay, so you said I should type them in the chat or just
if you could type the names in the chat,
okay.
That would be, I think, the easiest for people to be able to know exactly what they are. It's hard sometimes to figure out the spelling of a scientific name on your own.
That is fair. Sorry, let me pull up the chat Okay, so I'll do this from left to right. So well, now you're going to test my spelling capacity.
Lesley, and I can help with that too if you want to just speak.
Okay.
I just missed the first.
So here's our first one, Femaranthus piedmontanus, Piedmont fame flower. Then we have Mashalia legrandii, which is oak barons, Barbara's buttons. This one, I didn't mention this as I went through it the first time, but this was named after Harry Legrand, who is an amazing naturalist, really, but he's equally good botanist and ornithologist and really every ologist you can think of. Oh, I'm seeing, okay. Well, I'm going to keep typing here. I'm seeing that not everyone is able to see my responses, but maybe they can be copied and pasted.
Yes.
Okay. But anyway, this Barbara's buttons is named after Harry Legrand, who is one of our North Carolina heroes for rare species. He used to work for the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program, and he's now working on the Biodiversity Project, which is extremely interesting work. Smooth coneflower, and then Baptisia aberrans, which is, you're gonna have to forgive me, the Baptisia aberrans has so many words in the common name, I probably won't get it quite right, but I think people are calling it wild glade. No, glade wild blue indigo. It has all of those words, but perhaps more in the name. It's a long one. This Baptisia aberrans, like I was saying, until very recently, it was considered a variety of Australis. So it was Baptisia australis variety aberrans. You might have heard of it, referred to it that way before. But not too long ago, it was officially recognized as a full species. And it's a super interesting one. If you get to see it, granted this photo is just really highlighting the flowers. That's not so super unique to the species. What's really interesting is when you see the foliage, the leaves stand perpendicular to the ground. And so when you go to look straight over it, it's as though it disappears. It's, you know, an optical illusion. I wasn't able to see if there were other questions related to that. Was that what we wanted to stop me to cover?
Yes, I believe that was what everybody was asking about.
Okay.
All right. Please let me know if you cannot see. The flowers should be listed in the chat now for everyone.
Okay, great. Okie doke. Well, the next thing that I wanted to do was actually go to a check-in question. Oops. Or a poll. I'm just curious, those of you out there in the internets that I can't see, I realize now that lots of you are in the Triangle area, but I'm curious if before today you had heard of the North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, yes or no? And similarly, if you've heard of the Friends of Plant Conservation, yes or no?
All right, give everybody just another second or two to answer the poll.
Okay. I'm glad to know that at least most of you have heard of our program, although I'll definitely be speaking to those who haven't. And it's useful for me to know that it's about half and half for whether you've heard of our Friends of Plant Conservation, which is a nonprofit support group that is dedicated to helping the plant conservation program. Okay, well, moving on. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and tell you a little bit more about our program. So The North Carolina Plant Conservation Program is a state government agency within the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Like it says here on the slide, it's our mission to conserve the native plant species of North Carolina in their natural habitats now and for future generations. So we have several key tasks. We create and update the state list of protected plant species. We regulate activities concerning these listed species. We establish and manage nature preserves to protect these plants. We monitor rare plant populations. And we conduct research and biology on the habitat requirements and the management needs of rare species. So although each of these tasks is important, we spend the lion's share of our time on focusing on the establishment and management of what we call plant conservation preserves. We have 26 such sites throughout the state. They are state dedicated nature preserves, which is more or less the highest level of conservation you can obtain. They are specifically designated to target at least one state listed plant species in its natural habitat, although many of these are very rich sites and actually are able to simultaneously protect multiple imperiled species, which is efficient. However, it's always true that we aim to restore and maintain the natural communities and natural processes that make the habitat suitable for these target species. We're centrally located, the Plant Conservation Program, out of Raleigh. However, we do cover the whole state. But you can't be local to everywhere, right? And so we really rely on our partners to help us protect, manage, and promote the preserves throughout North Carolina. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about that too. So in just the Eno River Diabase Sill area in that northern Durham location I showed you on the map earlier, we have a variety of partnerships, including organizations and agencies shown here. These groups have been instrumental in land acquisitions, monitoring of rare species, augmentation, reintroduction, and safeguarding of rare species, habitat restoration and management. And this goes both ways. So these partnerships aren't just other groups that support us. I mean, we're in it together. So several of these organizations also do this work, and that we're able to bring more hands to accomplish these goals, because many of us have small teams, but when we come together, we can suddenly get a lot more done. For each of these topics that I just mentioned, the acquisition, monitoring, restoration, at least 3 of the partnering organizations and agencies shown here have participated. What I mean to say, it's not just that we have one partner for one task and another for a separate task. Each of these groups are coming together to multiply the impact and work together on both our preserves and these other nature preserves in the same area with the common goal of good stewardship and preservation of these really special places. So I just want to give a little shout out to our partners there. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a quick overview about our approach to what conserving these wildflowers in this area needs to look like. Although to say, oh, well, you buy the land that they grow on and create a nature preserve, that sounds fairly simple, but not everything is available. And maybe some areas are protectable and some aren't. And maybe there's places in between that, someone has a house on. So how do you make it work with this complicated landscape? It's not the same as, recreating Yellowstone or something, some large expanse. This is a very pixelated type of conservation. And so the work that we're doing out here is really centered around our cornerstone species, the smooth coneflower. It's certainly a lovely poster child and is nice and photogenic, but knowing things that are important to managing this species help us make a better strategy. So for this species, since we can't create one large expanse of protected area, we're focusing on making sure that what we are protecting is functionally connected. So focusing on pollinators as the critical linkage between those broken pieces of landscape. So just real quickly, I know that this map isn't terribly easy for you to see, but you can see this is Granville County and Durham County. And what's highlighted here in this red circle at the bottom is the cluster of smooth coneflower locations in and around the Eno Diabase Sill area. Here's what that area looks like on this map of managed areas. So In the black outline is the Eno River Diabase Sill Conservation Area. The blue is Falls Lake. There are other state and local protected areas within here. Oops, too far. For those of you who are familiar with the area, you might rapidly see characteristic Penny's Bend in the Eno River here. And what's being highlighted are several of the important soil series, as well as some protected ownership, the blue and the green. So there are several extant coneflower subpopulations in this area, not just one patch that's protected. They're scattered in a diffuse area. What we wanted to know was how we're going to connect these. And so we first measured what's the shortest distance to connect the outlier populations. The ones that are close together are probably fairly connected with pollinators anyway, and they'll receive similar management. But what about the ones that are furthest out? We measured those that are about 1.6 kilometers to a maximum of about 3 kilometers. Well, hold that in your mind for a second. And let me tell you that we've also had the opportunity to have a student several years ago research what the pollinators for the species are. We found out that bees are the most effective pollinators, and skippers and butterflies are frequent foragers, but poor pollinators. So thinking about bees, how far will bees go to forage? And what it comes down to is that most will travel less than 2 kilometers from nest to forage site. Of course, there's lots and lots of species of bee, over 400 native bees in just our state of North Carolina. So this is averaging, but if we use the less than 2 kilometer metric, that gives us some idea of whether or not disparate populations of, or disconnected subpopulations of coneflower might still be functionally connected by their pollinators. Interestingly, distances of those foraging flights are decreased as foraging habitat increases. So understanding these different nuances give us a little bit of a way to plan for what we need to do beyond just buying land. Here I've got just a couple of examples of still how we can use the one species to highlight the multiple ways that these partners are coming together to really try and be as effective as possible at conserving the wildflowers. Again, some of the biggest emphasis is on smooth coneflower, but in most cases, the work we're doing for smooth coneflower is benefiting dozens of other important species. So we do things like prescribe burns, we collect seeds, grow out plants, monitor their progress, and are able to use that effort to understand how we're doing, kind of take our pulse on our work. How, is it going well? Is it just staying stable? Are we getting anywhere? For these augmentations in particular, this is usually work we do after quite a bit of restoration focus first. So we're trying to use our management techniques to allow the subpopulations to naturally respond and let natural selection, also play a part in selecting those genes that will be carried on. But some subpopulations are in too poor of shape to be able to respond to even the best management. So we have been working with the North Carolina Botanical Garden, as well as the Friends of Plant Conservation, to collect seeds from these populations, subpopulations really, and grow out plants and boost the natural populations. This is really productive work. So I described a couple different things that we work on, some of which is volunteer suitable and some of it isn't, but I just wanted to let you know there are ways that you can get involved in this work. Not everything is prescribed burning and super technical or dangerous. We also offer a series of work and learn days where we're interested and excited to have volunteers come help us with invasive plant removals, brush cutting, seed cleaning and sowing, and outplanting. I'm gonna take a quick poll question. We're rapidly running out of time, but I wanted to just ask you all, so I'd have some inkling of whether or not you'd be interested in joining us.
And after this poll, Lesley, we do have a few questions.
Sounds great.
And Lesley, if you want to share information about this with me, we can put it in a follow-up after,
Okay,
to registrants after this talk.
that sounds good. Okay, excellent. So I'm happy to hear that about half of you are interested. So I'm going to just skip through a couple of slides and just show you contact information here. These opportunities are almost all orchestrated through the Friends of Plant Conservation. This like excursion that Joanna was talking about, where the Friends are partnering with Botanical Garden, is another example where they're doing a lot of that outreach communication on our behalf, although we work, you know, shoulder to shoulder to do it. But I would encourage you to keep up with these opportunities through their website at ncplantfriends.org. You can feel free to email me at any time as well. Those of you who are not in the Durham area, since that's the area I was focusing on for this talk, going to our website, which is ncplant.com, you'll be able to see the location of our other preserves. We do very similar work throughout the state at our other preserves, and perhaps you live close to one of our other sites, not just this River Diabase area.
And on that note, Lesley, we've got one person that says they haven't received any notice of volunteer opportunities this year and was just curious if there will be some coming up. Right,
so as you can imagine, this year has been different in just about every direction possible, right? And so the Friends of Plant Conservation did cancel their normal schedule of activities. They typically do an event like once per month from, say, March through October. But with the pandemic this year, especially in the early months, we were just unable to keep that going with all the changes that we needed to accommodate. But we are anticipating at least one work day in October or November. We've been hinted at a little bit in one of those slides, but we've been growing a lot of rare plants to outplant at a site in Granville County in Butner, the Picture Creek Diabase barrens. And we're definitely going to be looking for volunteers to help us with that. So stay tuned. If you're already receiving information, when we do get some dates, we'll certainly be broadcasting that after being quiet for so long.
Right.
Something we hope to return to as soon as we can.
Great. And along those lines, we've got some questions about rare plants. How many state-listed rare plant species are there?
Right, so there are currently 419 state-listed species for North Carolina. That's been the same list since 2010. So if you've heard about updates since then, that's the list we're working with. And those incorporate endangered, threatened, and special concern vulnerable categories, which are just different rankings of how imperiled they are. Importantly, for the North Carolina protected plant list, those different designations do not come with different levels of protection. You're either on the list or you're not. Those designations don't warrant you more or less protection. But so the entire list is 419, but a subset of those are those different categories.
Okay. And along those lines, when will there be an updated list?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. So we've been working through a series of updates, and our board, who has the regulatory authority to actually establish this list, has approved our most recent set of proposed updates. They have been sent to the Office of Administrative Hearings so that it could be put out for a public comment period. That frankly is a little delayed. It was supposed to happen earlier this year, and then lots of things have been put onto a different timeline. So I don't know when that's going to go out. I had thought it would have gone out already, but it could be any day, essentially, that that proposed set of updates will be available for people to review. And then once our scientific committee has had the opportunity to evaluate any comments or that come through that process, final updates will be made, and then it'll go to the legislature for an actual rule update. This is an official regulation under the North Carolina Plant Protection and Conservation Act, and so it does require the legislature to vote on it. We anticipate the fact that the legislature has been obviously very occupied with other issues I mean to make light of it, but it's rearranged the whole schedule that we thought we could anticipate. So it's happening, but I really don't know when. Stay tuned.
All right, I think we all understand that, but it's good to hear that it is moving forward and you are working on it. I've got 2 more questions for you, and we are quickly running out of time, I see. So I've got one: are burns or edge burns ever used to maintain mountain bogs like the Pinola bog and the beech mountain bog? Both of those seem to be filling in with mature trees.
So that's a great question. The short answer is yes. Mountain bogs, some of them anyway, are burned fairly regularly, although in the grand scheme of things, this is still a newer niche of prescribed burning. I mean, longleaf pine and grasslands have been burned for way longer, for instance. Our program has been burning at least one of our bogs. It is hard to generalize though, because there are some mountain bogs, which of course is actually a really diverse series of natural communities. Some of them I wouldn't say fire is appropriate for, but many of them it is. And I think as we have more and more successive collectively of land managers working with mountain bogs, I think more are finding opportunities to incorporate prescribed burning. So I think in the short term, like with Pinola bog that was mentioned, they're working on still the tree thinning and mechanical removal, or like by hand removal approach, maybe looking toward burning in the future. It's certainly complicated, but the short answer is yes. And I'll follow that up to say almost every place that burning in bogs has been added, we've had really great results. Plants popping back up after long periods of being dormant or thought lost, additional flowering. We're seeing good results. So hopefully more and more of that can happen where suitable.
Thank you, Lesley. I've got one more question for you before we wrap things up. Wanted to know if you or the organizations you work with have initiated relationships with or give credit to the Black and Indigenous people who historically conserved the land and plants in the Piedmont.
I would say this is a extremely nascent part of anything that we've been doing. It's something that we probably just need an incredible amount of education to move forward, to be able to do that. I don't think that we currently have the capacity to even understand much more or much beyond the last 50 years to 100 years. And we've got a whole lot of work to do to build up our education and understanding further back than that. And I think as soon as we're able to do that or can be educated, we would be benefited from doing that. I think the work that we're doing is couched in a lot of unknowns, and that's a whole area of the most unknown, I would say. Does that answer the question for the person who asked? If there's a way to follow up.
I think it does, and I'll see if she comments in the chat and let you know if she has further questions, or in the Q&A. Please continue to put questions in the Q&A. We've got just a couple minutes. Lesley, I assume you have a few more slides you wanted to go through if people want to stick around.
Yeah, well, I think that's a pretty good stopping place. I'm happy for any other questions, actually, if there's more. The other slides that I had were just more pictures of volunteers doing things. I think the point came across.
Great. So if anybody has any other questions for Lesley, please type them in the Q&A.
You know what? I did just think of one extra question if people aren't signing off, or not a question, but an additional point I wanted to make. Over the this summer, the Friends of Plant Conservation, for the first time ever, brought on a couple of student interns. They, partly to fill the outreach gap that we were really struggling with by not being able to interact with people in our normal way on the ground at the preserves. And one of the students just made a story map, which is like a interactive platform, I guess, to provide more information about our Durham preserves that I was just talking about. So that will be published I think this week on the Friends of Plant Conservation website. So definitely check out ncplantfriends.org and look for the preserves information, and you'll see for Eno River a story map where you can learn even more of the background that I was breezing over, and has a little bit more information about some of the work we're doing there, with some maps you can see before and afters and things like that.
Great, thank you, Lesley. Appreciate that additional information. Thank you, Lesley, very much for joining us today. Thank you to all the participants and for your great questions of Lesley. Just as a reminder, when you close this tab or you close out of this Zoom, you'll be redirected to a short survey for this program. So we'll greatly appreciate your feedback. And we hope you'll join us in a couple of weeks for our next virtual Lunchbox talk. Thanks, everyone.